Today I'm going to talk a bit about Fanatic, or Specialist Games, which was a department that I ran for several years, and which was set up to support what were called specialist games at the time. But to understand why Fanatic was set up in the first place, it's probably helpful if I talk a little bit about the specialist games and how they evolved and how they came into being. Specialist games were basically everything that all of the games that Games Workshop made, apart from Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000. When the fourth edition of Warhammer came out and the third edition of 40k, it was Games Workshop had evolved and changed from the way it had been before, those two versions of the game, they came in a box. They had two starter armies. They'd be very recognizable to anybody who plays the hobby nowadays. Basically, you got everything you needed in the box. And then we started doing army books and codexes to support the miniatures that were being made for those. So there was a very kind of coherent plan, basically. And the idea was that around about every 4 years, we'd do a new starter set and then cycle through the codexes and the army books again. So it was kind of like a 4-year cycle. It would go Warhammer, off year, 40k, off year, Warhammer, off year, and so on and so on and so on. But there was a problem with that, which was that in the off years you didn't get the excitement of the starter set coming out, which tended to spike sales up. So the decision was made that what we really needed to do was do something in the off years, and the question was what? And the answer that Rick Priestley really came up with was to do what he called a secondary game system at the time. And the idea with the secondary game systems were that they'd be brought out around about September time, which is normally when the starter sets were launched. And they would be on an interesting subject set in the Warhammer world or in the 40k galaxy. And they would have a limited tail of support, so there'd be some miniatures and things that came out for them after they came out. But they'd only be around for about sort of like 6 months, maybe a year. And then they'd be retired because they were an end in themselves. Everything you need to play those games would have been made. And then the new starter set would come out for 40k or Warhammer, whichever it was. And then the following year, there'd be another secondary game system, which would then sort of drop. And that would kind of like avoid kind of like that kind of like effect on sales phase. Yeah. Oh, exactly. Peak and trough. That's a very good way of putting it. So that was the plan, which fell over almost straight away because what we found, I think Necromunda was the first of the secondary game systems that came out, and it just proved to be very, very popular. And for a lot of people, it was their favourite Games Workshop game, and so there was a great demand for it to be kept available and for new stuff to be made for it. And that happened with almost all of the secondary game systems, as they were called. Their name changed fairly quickly because secondary sounded a bit derogatory.
Sure. Yeah.
And so they started to be called specialist games from then because we knew that they weren't as popular as the core game systems and they tended to appeal to a niche. Usually experienced hobbyists. Yeah, people generally started off with Warhammer or 40k.
Yeah. Whereas they're kind of specifically what they're wanting out of a...
Exactly. They scratched, and quite often they'd scratch a different itch. So, Blood Bowl ended up in there, which was pretty much a board game played with miniatures, really, and obviously a sports game too. And you would get things like Epic being kind of like becoming a specialist games, then which was tiny little models, and Inquisitor, which was effectively 54mm models and a skirmish game, very detailed skirmish game. Anyway, so we got to this state where it was starting to become a bit of a problem, basically, because there was a lot of demand for support for the specialist games, but the difficulty was how were we going to do that? Because if they were supported in the full way, we just didn't have the resources to be able to deal with that. So what was decided was that we set up a small department which would bring out support for all of the specialist games that had been out there. Occasionally new models, that would only be available through mail order, but there'd be some new models coming out for them every now and then, and there'd be magazines, basically. A bit like fanzines is the way that we did it. So back then, most of us could still remember fanzines, which were print publications, tended to be done by hobbyists. I think it started off with science fiction stuff in the 1920s, basically. And that people would print them and then post them out to people, basically. So the idea really was that we'd do things a little bit like that. So that plan was made, and I wasn't particularly involved with that, but I heard about it. And at the time I was working in the main studio, and basically I kind of like put my hand up and said I'd really like to be working in this department. I love a lot of these games. I've designed several of them.
Oh yeah, that was going to be my question. I suppose. Yeah, why did you stick your hat there? Is it just the passion of the games?
Yeah, I think that it was the passion for the games, and at the time, I was starting. I'd had a different job for a while, which isn't worth particularly going into, but within Games Workshop, looking after the hobby basically, and the way that games were played in our stores and things like that. I'd come back to the studio, but then I'd found myself kind of like back doing stuff that I'd done just before I left, and I thought, well, this sounds more exciting, basically. So I said, oh, I'd love to do that, the powers that be basically said, okay, yes, you can do that. You will become. They decided to call the department Fanatic, so I got the wonderful job title of head Fanatic. The idea being, with the title being that the stuff that we were making was for Games Workshop Fanatics, basically, and niche, kind of like grognards, who loved these games. And I had a small team of people, very small at the beginning, a bunch of miniatures that had pretty much been ones that had been made when the games were being produced, or were test pieces done by like miniature sculptors that some people had found in a drawer lying around somewhere, more or less, which I've done with miniatures I could release at launch. And we had to figure out how to do a magazine for each of the specialist games. So to start off with, this Exterminatus is an example here of the Inquisitor magazine. We've got Town Crier in the bigger one there. I think that's best orb. If that's the best orb, take it fine. So we'd do these little tiny magazines. I can't about once or a quarter maybe for each particular game, maybe even twice a year. But they were separate. They were all separate. So there was one for War Master, there was one for Epic, there was one for Big Inquisitor, and so on, one for Blood Bowl. So we'd bring out those magazines, and then occasionally bring out miniatures. And I had a column that I wrote in White Dwarf magazine, basically letting people know what was going on and say what we were doing each month. So there was it was a little bit like a standard bearer column, except for the Specialist Gas Division. We went along like that, and it worked okay, basically. It worked quite well. And the department that I got slowly grew. We started off in an office with the Black Library crew, I think it was primarily. And there were just a handful of us. And then we got moved, we got bigger offices elsewhere. We moved in all round Games Workshop head office. We had various different offices that we stayed in. And the team slowly grew along as we went along. So I think that this issue of Fanatic Magazine, if we can kind of like show that, because this is the team really at its height, pretty much. So we had miniature designers, like editors and games writers, and they were just a fantastic crew of people. So I've often said that writing a game or doing the stuff that Games Workshop does, it's a team effort. It depends on the team of people who are involved. And I was very, very lucky to have a fantastic team of people to work with.
Can you remember how the team was picked?
We get job interviews, basically. We were looking for people that, often internally people would come along and ask. So Andy Hall, in particular, was working in mail order and kept pestering me. And ended up joining the team fairly early on. And then we realised that we needed people with particular skills. I think particularly with regard to project planning, which I wasn't particularly very good at, and miniature design, which I couldn't do at all. We needed people within the department to do some stuff like that. So people were recruited in to fill those roles, and the department slowly built up.
Yeah, like I say, because otherwise resources are being used elsewhere on, like if the studio is making 40k or fantasy, you can't take that resource away to do Battlefield Conclave or something.
Exactly. Well, I think the idea as well with setting up Fanatic separately was that if it had just been done through the main books and publications studio, the feeling was that what would happen pretty quickly is that people would get sidetracked onto doing stuff for the core game systems because they had kind of like Warhammer 40k was so popular, and they had this kind of almost gravitational pull. If you were in books and publications, you ended up doing things for them, and it was very difficult to justify for the studio management doing things for the specialist games division. So Fanatic was set up and kind of ring-fenced off. It was completely separate from books and publications, an independent little operation. And as I say, we kept on doing things like that. I think right from the start, I said that it's really difficult doing individual magazines. The quality tends to suffer a little bit, and it's a weird kind of like process to go through because you're jumping from one thing to the other.
Sure.
So I finally managed to convince everybody that what we should have is just one magazine which covered all of the games, which is where Fanatic Magazine came in. And I think I was lucky in a way, because by the time we started to do this, we'd had a lot of practice doing kinds of these other magazines.
Yeah, no discredit to Exterminatus as an example, but you can see a difference in quality.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I still love Exterminatus here. It's a great magazine, but the quality differences.
I think the content was fine. But it took us a while to really be able to figure out how to do all of the layout properly, effectively. And so I mean they had to be black and white inside. They were relative tiny print runs and stuff like that. But with Fanatic Magazine, we could bundle everything together, and so it became a full color magazine. And I was really proud of it, actually. I think that it did a lot of really cool stuff. And we were able to support all of these game systems to an extent. I think that, sort of looking back, we were spread too thin, even once we'd got the full team of people. It was a very hand-to-mouth operation.
I've always perceived it as very ambitious, trying to support so many different games like Fanatic. There are dedicated players for every single one of these games. I'm trying to please everyone, with the best you can,
Absolutely, and it was very much like that. And I think that I'd never really been a manager particularly before, so it was a learning process for me. I can remember that in particular, what I had to do was wrap my head around the manufacturing process of miniatures, which was arcane and convoluted, particularly with metal miniatures. I ended up drawing these I had a big piece of A3 paper, and I'd kind of draw on it, like say you do this, and then it would be lying down here, and then yes, no, kind of there's enormous great big kind of like graph that I could then look up and then understand where things were at the different stages, and who I needed to go to speak to, because quite often stuff would get held up because we were a little tiny department, and if something needed to be done urgently for 40k, then our start would get shunted back. So I needed to know who to go to talk to and make friends with, really, to make sure I call in favours for help when I could to get things going. And I think that with hindsight, if I'd been more experienced, I probably would have tried to say from the start, this is overly ambitious. We shouldn't try to cover everything from the beginning. Why don't we pick some low-hanging fruit to start off with?
Yeah.
But I wasn't experienced enough to know that, so we went full bore for trying to cover everything. I think what I'll do is I'll probably come back to talking a little bit about some of the hits and misses and things that I remember fondly from what I worked on and within the department, and then just kind of go through the story of Fanatic, because I think, as I said, we were spread quite thin, and we were reasonably successul. Yeah, we were profitable.
It was around for a few years, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was. It was. We definitely. I would say we were profitable, but not at the level that the studio was and stuff like that. Proportionally. And unfortunately, what happened was that Games Workshop hit a kind of bump in the road and had a particularly tough year or two, really. And savings needed to be made. Really across the board at Games Workshop. So quite a lot of people got, departments were downsized, basically. And the decision was made that the specialist games was, it was just too much of a resource. It wasn't just downsizing. It wouldn't really help terribly much. What would be better would be to let some people go and reallocate other people.
Put those resources back into 40k and fantasy and elsewhere.
Absolutely.
Sure.
And basically that's what happened. So Fanatic got shut down, and that was a very tough time. I think because it was a fantastic team of people. We were working really well together. We loved working with each other.
How it feels like a bit of a passion project as well. Like you said, you mentioned these are games you helped develop from the get-go.
Well, so it was hard, and I felt like I'd failed the team. Basically, I really did. So it took, it knocked me back a bit, and I know that it was tough for everybody. Fortunately, and one thing I've learned over the years, because obviously working at Workshop, people come and go, is that good people are good people. And that they land on their feet, basically, because they're good people. And we had a great team. So in the end, I think things worked out well for everybody. But it was very tough at the time. But I don't really want to dwell on that because there was so much cool stuff that we did. So there was a lot of stuff that I learned, and one of the lessons which was that actually. I don't really like being a manager. That was hard work. I do like being a games designer, and that it makes sense to concentrate on what you're good at, and accept what you're not quite so good at. So I learned to accept that I wasn't going to be running departments and becoming the head of the studio and things like that. And indeed, I didn't want to.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think if you look at the stuff that I did after them, I returned to my roots of kind of like writing rule books in particular, and working on the projects. So a lot of the great memories I've got from being within Fanatic are some of the projects that I led up, because basically with so few people, we had to rely on the community quite a lot.
So there's also fan articles, isn't it?
And absolutely, there are plenty of fan articles. So we relied on the fans to provide material that we could use in the magazines. And we also did quite a lot of work setting up forums, actually, specialist games forums for each of the games, which we kind of like ran, but then we got moderators in from the community.
So you kind of just hosted it, and the community then ran itself, kind of thing.
Absolutely, and those proved to be really, really helpful when we were developing new game systems, because we did do new games, and I think that or reprint new editions of rule books were produced by the department. So we did, I think, probably. Most famously, like Blood Bowl, different rule books for Blood Bowl. So effectively, the 4th edition of Blood Bowl came out through Fanatic, and Epic Armageddon. There was an Necromunda rule book. So we did rule books.
Underhive, wasn't it?
Yes, Underhive. Yeah. So we did books like that, and in particular with for me, my main focus in terms of rules writing was on Blood Bowl and Epic, but both of which were game systems that effectively I'd kind of like, like big-handed, really, and they were favourite games of mine, and I think in particular with Epic, I know that Epic 40,000 hadn't done terribly well when it had come out, and so I wanted to do something about that. What I was able to do was basically draw on the community, both for Blood Bowl and for Epic, and get a good team of people, like rules committees, effectively was what we tended to call them, who just, like donated their time. They never got paid or anything like that. And all I could do was thank them a lot, really.
Yeah.
But I ended up with great teams of people giving me a lot of absolutely invaluable support.
Sure. I think the same. I think the same would be said for the other game systems as well, like Battlefleet Gothic and Inquisitor. They also had, because you did really have a hand. Like Inquisitor, as an example, is kind of Gav's baby. But I know that there's a lot of community resource that's gone into that game. So. Yeah.
No, that's absolutely correct. So I think all of the game systems benefited from having great fan-based communities that provided us with a lot of written content, and also helped us kind of like effectively play test the games, because again we didn't have enough staff within the department, so we could do some play testing, but not a lot. And the communities really helped with that. So I think that out of all the rule books that I've ever written, I think that for Games Workshop, the Epic Armageddon rule book is the closest you'll get to one where it's me writing a rule book like I wanted to write a rule book.
Sure.
I was the head of the department. I didn't have anybody telling me that I had to do it any different way, so I did it the way that I wanted to.
Sure.
And so there are lots of elements in that book, if you look at it, that you can see that I consider to be important. So the rules are as tight as I could make them. I used section numbers to make cross-referencing easier. I remember I had I limited the number of special rules. It also covers all of the back catalogue, tells you what to do with old models that you've got and how you can incorporate them into games. I like the scenario section a lot. It really kind of like deconstructs the way the scenarios works, and then kind of like says you can put them together like this, or you can put them together like that. And because the playtesters for it was so good, it hardly needed any errata or anything over the years. And is still being played to this day. So just recently, earlier this year actually, I was at a convention called BrickCon.
Oh yeah.
It's just cool. It's good fun, and I was there actually promoting a game that I've written since I left Games Workshop called Valor and Fortitude. But we were just tidying up, and some two Frenchmen came down, and they said, "We've been playing in the Epic Armageddon tournament," which I didn't really realise was going off. You've been playing in the Epic Armageddon tournament. Can you sign our rule books for us? We love playing the game. They're still playing it basically pretty much the same version that we produced all those years ago. So. Yeah, that was a fantastic experience.
So it's a really humbling experience, is that having complete strangers come up to you and say, "Oh, a game you created 20 plus years ago, we still think is awesome."
Yeah, it's nuts. It was fantastic, and that stuff like that is great. And the other thing was, in slightly differently, was Blood Bowl. Like building up the Blood Bowl community. Blood Bowl was very popular. And I managed to almost completely alienate all of the people who were playing Blood Bowl at the time by launching a fairly all thought out set of modifications to the rules when I set up Fanatic. But I think if I've got a good quality, is that I do listen to people, and I will say, okay, I made a mistake though. So I say, okay, I'm sorry, like mea culpa. And I got together a group of people to say, to guide me and say, okay, what do the community want? How are we going to work this out? And the kind of like the 4th edition rules, as they're called, kind of grew out of that process.
Sure.
But that wasn't, Epic Armageddon was a complete new game. Blood Bowl really just needed some tidying up, some tweaks and twiddles. In the end, the rules committee, we used to have an annual rules review basically for a lot of the game systems. And for Blood Bowl, it tended to boil down to working out the points, the costs of the different players.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas I think like things like Inquisitor, as an example, was really just an expansion of the original rule set. There's new things like new psychic powers, new weaponry, new characters, and things like that. And so I don't think the rules or such ever really got tinkered with.
No, I don't.
Not additional resources for world building, and
I don't think we'd really tinkered with any of the rules apart from Epic Armageddon. I really needed to, basically. I think we were. It wasn't particularly our remit, and not we weren't really doing new editions because we were supporting the ones that were there, and that were people who were
building off of them.
Yeah, sort of, because I was supporting the communities that were still playing those games. That was what we were trying to do, and so we could help by tidying up the rule books. So with Epic, it really needed a relaunch. But with Blood Bowl, there was a big community out there, and so quite a lot of the effort went into tidying the rules up, making sure that the teams were as balanced as we could get them, and then organising things like the Blood Vault championships and things. So we organised those with the help of the rules committees. And one of the things that I was really pleased with that came out of Fanatic was that as part of that, I knew that playing in tournaments and leagues was a big thing for Blood Bowl. And I knew that I couldn't give that a huge amount of support because we just didn't have the resources and the time. But when I was young, I used to play like ancient war games, so Romans versus Celts, or Greeks versus the Persians, or something like that. And there was a magnificent society called the Society of Ancients, which weren't old people. They were people who played ancient war games, and they brought out a magazine. But it had been going for donkey's years. It had been going since the 1960s, and still going now. And the reason that it was so successful is that it had basically a charter. It was set up. There were election of you get to vote for who was going to be the editor of the magazine and the treasurer. And
it's something you incorporated then, isn't it?
I stole that idea. I thought, well, basically what the strength, because I knew, so I'd also had experience with what's called the Warhammer Players Society, the WPS. Now, that was an independent organisation that had grown up to support Warhammer, but it was run by a chap called Rob Broom, who was a force of nature, fantastic chap. He set it up, and when he left, it had no structures in place to keep, and it just fell down as soon as he wasn't there. So I thought, well, just setting up a Blood Bowl Players Society, that probably won't work. What we need is to try and set up a not-for-profit organisation that's there to support people playing, to encourage and support league and tournaments for Blood Bowl. And that's where the NAF came from, really. What I did was I got together with the rules committee. I basically wrote the charter. Which said it's going to be, so there were going to be annual elections and people were going to be voting, because I knew that democratic vote, the process, although it can cause infighting and can lead to acrimony, is very robust as well. It keeps on going. You've got a structure there that means that if somebody leaves in half, somebody else will step up and take their place, basically. So that was the idea with that. And I managed to convince Games Workshop to provide some support for that, and I could do it through so first of all, I managed to convince Games Workshop to give up the NAF as one of our trademarks, so that it could be named the NAF, which is obviously in Blood Bowl. And then I put aside some of my budget to do the blocking dice. So if you joined the NAF, one of the things you got was a unique set of blocking dice in particular colours, and we supplied those to start off with. And the NAF is still going, basically. In the end, Games Workshop kind of stopped providing the blocking dice, but fortunately the NAF was well enough run, and it was a fantastic team of people. Again, they've done so much for the hobby just to keep going. But I think that it's one of those things where I think that was a good thing that we were able to do, and I don't think something like that could have happened through any other bit of Games Workshop, because it was too kind of anarchic and crazy, and Fanatic was a slightly anarchic, crazy little
organization. That's going to do it, if anyone.
That's right. I think the other thing that I tend to look back on with real fondness, this is a silly thing. So
when things are encouraged.
We're obviously all hobbyists, all geeky, and the Lord of the Rings movies started coming out while Fanatic was being run, and it was Christmas. They came out at Christmas, and Games Workshop head office, we're actually filming just near it. There's a cinema called The Showcase, which is within walking distance. So I decided that for our Christmas party, for the year that the first of the Lord of the Rings movies come out, we were going to shut down the Fanatic studio for the day, and we were all going and bought tickets. So we all walked over to the Showcase, and we all watched Lord of the Rings, basically, and then went for a drink, I think, afterwards and stuff like that. We had the day off. We got to see Lord of the Rings. Absolutely. And that became a tradition. So we did that each week. We saw all three of the Lord of the Rings movies just before Christmas. And that was our Christmas party. And I think it gives you an idea of feel for what that team was like, basically. We were all in there together. That was the kind of stuff that we liked. and so there was a lot of joy that we had and a lot of fun that we had. Now, so I think that when it was tough, but like I say, looking back with hindsight, we were spread too thin. It was as Games Workshop grew and became more professional. Fanatic was very old school.
Yeah.
And I think that what the new version of specialist games have basically been run through the Forge World organisation. You can see a much more practical, sensible approach to the way they're doing, because it's got the same kind of things going on that we did, that Fanatic had, in that the Forge World is ring-fenced away from books and publications, and the main part of the almost its own little operation, but a very profitable one, very profitable. And it had a lot of expertise on making the miniatures and making products, basically, and distributing them and selling them, which I had none of when I set things up. And so when they decided to do Blood Bowl, they could do a proper new edition of it with new models, and
they had all the support,
and they didn't try to do everything all at the same time. They've slowly added in extra kind of specialist game.
I think it was about 2018 the relaunch was, and it's still kind of going on.
Also, they're doing ongoing support for it. They've done a fantastic job. They really have. And although it's not quite the same as Fanatic was, I think that they're much closer to Fanatic than they are necessarily to the main kind of fight. They're kind of like halfway.
It's a similar spirit of
Yes, absolutely. They've been doing some great stuff. And so it was very satisfying to see that those games coming out again, and being supported. And it's also very satisfying to see, like out there in the world, there's material that we've done that people are still using, and I say Epic Armageddon still being played. The new edition of Blood Bowl is very to the version that would.
I think all of them are. I myself still play Inquisitor. We're looking at picking up Battlefleet Gothics, and there are dedicated players. Dedicated communities for all of these games, as they were 20 years ago,
or even earlier. I mean, with Epic, you've got Net Epic, and various things for earlier editions of the games which people like. So there are communities out there playing more time. I wouldn't mention specifically, which is Thomas Pyrenees always very good as a
World Championship in Italy next year for that. I think it is.
It's absolutely very popular and a great game. There's the new edition of Necromunda. I think is interesting, in that that's actually really is a new edition of the game. You can see that it kind of like it's a more modern take on the rules, but excellent version of the game. So a lot of these games, they're all still out there, and I think that Fanatic did like a pretty good job really of kind of like filling in that gap.
Like you said, with the resources you had available to you, it's.
Well, I think that it was. So you learn as you're going along about what you're good at, and so if I'd been a better manager, I think that who knows, Fanatic might still be going today. I don't know, but that was on me. The stuff that we produced and the quality that we managed to get out with such limited resources is on the rest of the team. All of the guys that you kind of like see here. And the late Steve Hambrook, who's had the person who's not on here is Steve Hambrook, who was there from the start. He died, but very young, far too young. I think that it's bittersweet for me.
I can.
There's a lot of sweet in amongst the bitter, if that makes sense.
Yeah.